This episode explores two rebellions by the enslaved that changed the course of history and hastened the abolition of slavery in America and across the British Empire. In Jamaica, actor Ray Fearon discovers how one man bravely advocated non-violent resistance in the face of the most brutal oppression.
This is like the beginning of civil rights.
Absolutely, 100 years before Martin Luther King or Gandhi.
Whilst in New Haven, Connecticut, the great-great-grandson of Sengbe Pier, leader of the famous revolt on the slave ship the Amistad, investigates how it changed the perception of slavery in America.
Sengbe Pier is a light in a dark world. It's a very positive example, not only of the 1840s, but even in the 21st century.
And Lenny Henry helps tell the story of Cujo Kosala Lewis, a survivor of the Catilda, the last known ship to bring enslaved Africans to America.
When I think about that time, I try not to cry no more.
While the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. shines a light on the connection between another survivor of the Catilda and the civil rights movement.
My father clearly understood that we had to have free access to the ballot.
Actor Ray Fearon starred in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and Kenneth Branagh's film version of Hamlet. He's come to Jamaica to explore a history that is part of his identity. Ray was born in London to Jamaican parents.
My mother and father came from here to Great Britain to try to make a living and have a family. My mother left at 19, father left at 25. And they never saw their parents alive again. I'm proud to be Jamaican and I'm proud to be British. I am part of that experience.
Growing up in London, Ray knew little about his parents' life in Jamaica, except that his Jamaican-born father was descended from a group of escaped enslaved people known as Maroons.
My father's father was a Maroon. They fought the British. They didn't want to be slaves. They rebelled and ran off into the hills.
Because of the tradition of rebellion, or marronage, and the geography of Jamaica that enabled the Maroons to evade capture, the British treated the enslaved here harshly.
Jamaica is a very mountainous country, a very heavily forested country. That lent itself to various forms of resistance and marronage and rebellion, and also the attempt to suppress this type of rebellion made Jamaica a case where violence was rampant.
The mainstay of the Jamaican economy was sugar. Roughly half of the enslaved population worked on plantations. Such was the demand for labor, enslaved Africans soon outnumbered white settlers by 10 to 1.
How did this small number of whites control this large number of enslaved Africans? Well, many times they would find the most rebellious, the biggest, or the most influential enslaved African on a plantation and publicly whip that person. A lot of times, planters even went beyond the legal limits of whipping. Women were raped, men were castrated to terrorize people.
Ray has been reading the infamous diaries kept by one planter, Thomas Thistlewood. To find out more about him, Ray is meeting Dr. Shani Roper, museum curator at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica's capital, Kingston.
Now, I've come across these personal diaries and their horrific accounts of treatments to slaves on plantations, and I want to know more.
Okay. Thomas Thistlewood, he comes to Jamaica in 1750.
Yeah.
He becomes an overseer and then eventually purchases his own plantation. He kept a diary consistently. It works out to be about 10,000 pages of notations of daily life. Who he was, however, is a sadist and a rapist. And he got great pleasure, I would say, in inflicting pain. No one was safe. This particular enslaved woman, Sally, over the course of 3-4 years, Thistlewood had raped that particular woman over 200 times. The enslaved women, they run away very often. And, they would bring them back. He would put them in stocks, get them whipped, and then he would have sex with them. A lot.
Yeah.
And multiple times.
Flogged Fanny for fighting with Phoebe, and twice after for her great impudence. Flogged Lincoln for not bringing Sally Saturday evening. Put a collar and chain around her neck and branded her with TT on her right cheek. Her private parts is torn, which was discovered this morning by her having bled a very great deal.
The TT hair on her right cheek will indicate to the community who she was, who she belonged to.
The property of
Thomas. The property of Thomas Thistlewood.
Reading all these accounts about these enslaved people, the fact that you can put names, Sally, Darby, these are our ancestors. That could have been my father's mother.
My parents are both born in Jamaica and grew up there and worked there and had children there. And I know it sounds hard to understand, but they didn't talk to us about slavery at all.
It's just a sadistic, horrendous collection of tales. We're very familiar with Nazi Germany, and there's pictures of those bodies when they got to some of the camps. Imagine if we had pictures of some of the stuff that went on in the fields and at houses and plantations. It would just be horrendous.
The most optimistic reading you can make of the diary of Thomas Thistlewood is that he must have been a psychopath. But the problem is that Thistlewood mentions in his diary other slave owners who, it's apparent from what he's saying, know what he's doing and are doing something similar. And that leads you to the far less comforting conclusion that this man was not an exception.
As planters, like Thomas Thistlewood, brutally tried to impose control, it would only be a matter of time before the enslaved people of Jamaica could take no more and would rise up. And in America, a bloody revolt aboard the slave ship the Amistad leads to a court case that will change the course of history. By the early 19th century, Britain and most of America's northern states had taken steps towards the abolition of slavery. But the moral arguments of the abolitionists held little sway with plantation owners in the Deep South or parts of Latin America. Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, is one of the oldest and most prestigious educational institutions in the US. Today, it's proud of its association with the rescue of a Spanish-owned slave ship from Cuba, the Amistad, discovered in American waters in 1839.
The story of the Amistad is incredibly important in world history in the 19th century. It is one of several stories that becomes a cause célèbre during the period of growing abolitionism.
Samuel Pierre is the great-great-grandson of Sembe Pierre, who in 1839 led the revolt aboard the Amistad and challenged slavery in the American courts.
Sembe Pierre is a light in a dark world. It's a very positive example, not only of the 1840s, but even in the 21st century. And it reassures me of the power of diversity. It just reinforces my reason for being here. So justice for me is what I hope to accomplish.
Samuel has come to Yale to find out more about how a small but determined uprising of enslaved Africans helped change the perception of slavery in America.
David, it's such a pleasure to meet you.
He's meeting David Blight, Sterling Professor of History and African American Studies.
Can you tell me all you know about the Amistad Revolt, especially the role of my great-great-grandfather?
Well, what we know about your great-great-grandfather as a person is not enough. What we do know is that he led the insurrection aboard that ship.
The story came to light in the summer of 1839, when the Amistad was discovered by the US Navy, having strayed into American waters. On board were 53 enslaved people, including Samuel's great-great-grandfather, Sembe Pierre, captured in Sierra Leone in West Africa.
The Amistad captives, as they became known, revolted aboard that ship, killed the entire crew, except the captain and the first mate. Now, they were brought here to New Haven, Connecticut, jailed, in effect, in the city jail. What was their status? Who were they? Were these people slaves and murderers because they had killed the crew of the ship? Or were they free people who had liberated themselves and then were now liberated here on American soil?
There are repeated incidents of revolts on board slave ships. The slave traders on those ships lived in dreaded fear of the enslaved people, and they were absolutely right to do that because there was resistance routinely on slave ships.
In Yale's Beinecke Library is evidence of how public perception of enslaved Africans, at least in North America, was beginning to change.
My, that's nice.
It houses a unique collection of sketches of the Amistad captives made while they were awaiting trial. Most were from the Mende ethnic group.
These are done by a young man named William H. Townsend. Townsend, like all of his neighbors in New Haven, would have no doubt gone to the New Haven Green, where the Mende people were held in captivity.
It seems like an artist who had an unbiased mind, clear line of vision.
The government gave Western clothes to the Mende, and so some of these portraits, such as this portrait of Pona, really give a sense of what they were wearing while they were awaiting trial.
Yeah, a sense of determined young people who wanted to be active for their own liberation. That's impressive.
Portraits of enslaved Africans in the early 19th century are rare. They were often seen as less than human, as mere property or chattel.
They almost have a contemporary look to them. If you didn't know that these were done in 1839, 1840, they could be sketches that had been done in our own time.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I am very emotional to see all of these sketches of the enslaved Africans. Looking at each one of them, it just reflects the humanity in all of them. It shows the kind of world really I would rather have, where in spite of our diversity, we all have our common dignity. Very, very outstanding artwork.
The determination to win their freedom led the Amistad captives, with the support of American abolitionists, to take their fight to the Supreme Court in February 1841. They hired a former American president to represent them.
John Quincy Adams made the argument before the Supreme Court that whatever the status of that ship, these people deserved their freedom based on natural rights, on the rights they were born with. The majority on that court were justices who were themselves either slaveholders or pro-slavery in their sentiments. But nevertheless, they voted 7-1 to free the Amistad captives. It is an important historical moment when Americans got a lesson in morality. They got a lesson in the good and evil on both sides of this story.
Negroes of Amistad. These gentlemen were immediately informed yesterday of the decision of the Great Court that they were to be set at liberty.
That was great news. That must have been the best news that St. Pierre could have heard. He could not speak as much English, but in that Supreme Court, he was able to just burst into joy. The rest of the Africans in the court started singing, "We are going back home. Thank God we are going back home."
The Amistad case is a landmark decision because up until that point, all of the institutions of the American state were defending slavery and enslavement. And this was really the first major moment in which the Supreme Court says, no, they're human beings, just like you and me. That's a major development, and it had ricochets across the world.
In Jamaica, too, a revolt was afoot that would hasten the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. Actor Ray Fearon, who is descended from enslaved Africans in Jamaica, is here to find out more. Things came to a head in 1831, when a peaceful strike by the enslaved grew into a full-blown rebellion. The rebels were led by Sam Sharp, a 31-year-old preacher who himself was enslaved. Henry Bleeby, a Christian missionary, met Sharp on several occasions and recorded his impressions in a book.
He was of middle size. His fine, sinewy frame was handsomely molded, and his skin as perfect a jet as can be imagined. He had an eye whose brilliancy was almost dazzling.
In Montego Bay, Ray is meeting award-winning publisher Ian Randall, a leading authority on Sam Sharp. He wants to learn more about a name he's heard spoken of since his childhood.
This is a church with which Sam Sharp worshipped, and in fact, it's quite close to the estate where he worked.
Right. So this would have been the actual pulpit he would have preached from?
Oh, yes. This is where he expounded his ideas about freedom to fellow slaves. And this is where the inspiration for the 1831 rebellion took place.
I heard him 2 or 3 times deliver a speech. I was amazed both at the power and freedom with which he spoke. He appeared to have the feelings and passions of his hearers completely at his command.
But Sam Sharp's influence extended far beyond the walls of his church.
Many Africans were educated. They learned how to read by reading the Bible. And they were allowed by their owners to travel. Sam Sharp traveled all across Jamaica, preaching the gospel to other enslaved people. But while he was doing that, he was also preaching what came to be known as liberation theology, which is the idea that the Bible sanctions freedom of all people.
Most attempted rebellions by the enslaved in the Caribbean were armed and violent. But Sam Sharp advocated peaceful protest.
Because of his religious upbringing, he was instinctively against violence. His aim was to create the first sit-down strike.
So this is like the beginning of civil rights?
Absolutely. 100 years before Martin Luther King or Gandhi, here was a young black slave in Jamaica who developed this concept of peaceful protest.
Wow.
And it would have worked had it not been for the reaction of the white planter class.
That reaction would lead to a violent struggle with many deaths on both sides. But it would also hasten the abolition of slavery.
We shouldn't feel ashamed about any of that.
On the island of Jamaica, actor Ray Fearon is exploring the story of the Sam Sharp Rebellion. On Christmas Day, 1831, Sharp and his fellow rebels went on strike for wages and better living conditions. But 2 days later, it became clear the plantation owners were not going to meet their demands. The strikers began to set fire to the sugarcane crop.
So what was the strategy behind starting the fires?
Part of the strategy was to use the burning of the estates and the smoke, which would have been visible far away, as a signal to other estates to start lighting their estates in very, very carefully planned sequence.
Right.
And the second part of the strategy was to hit at the economic base of the sugar estates.
So all that was a peaceful process because they didn't mean any harm to property or people?
Absolutely not. Sam Sharp's philosophy was of non-violent confrontation.
The British didn't take it that way, did they?
In response to the burning of the sugar estates, the colonial authorities imposed martial law. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by the British forces. "14 whites died in the uprising. More than 200 rebels were killed. Their heads were cut off and mounted on the plantation fences. More than 300 rebels, including Sam Sharp, were rounded up, put on trial, and then executed.
To the very end, even while he was in jail and awaiting trial, he was constantly encouraging the other prisoners who were there, keep their spirits up. And right at the very end, He said that he would rather go to the gallows than live a slave.
Than live a slave.
15 months after the execution of Sam Sharp, in August 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed in the House of Commons. The rebellion and the violence it sparked is believed to have contributed to the passage of the act through the House.
At the end of Sam Sharp's rebellion, there was some agreement that it was not a case of whether or not there would be another rebellion in Jamaica, but when that rebellion would take place. And so the economics of the slave system began to change, because the cost of garrisoning an island in which an enormous slave population was almost guaranteed to rise up again started making sugar slavery look less attractive.
They fought for their freedom. And I am here and a product of that freedom. I am proud of that, because I stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm proud to be who I am, and I'm proud where I come from, and who I come from. We shouldn't feel ashamed about any of that.
Slavery had now been outlawed throughout the British Empire and America's northern states. But an illegal trade in enslaved Africans to plantation owners in America's southern states persisted. In May 2018, editor Deborah Plant published Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo, by writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston. It was written in 1931, but had lain unpublished in archives for over 80 years.
When we look at the narrative that Zora Neale Hurston safeguarded for us, she's showing us this humanity which was denied, this whole cultural wealth of African American peoples.
The book contains interviews in the vernacular with Cujo Kossela Lewis. He was transported across the Atlantic on the Catilda, thought to be the last ship to illegally carry enslaved Africans to America. The Catilda's human contraband was landed in Mobile, Alabama. An extraordinary collection of early photographs of the crew and captives of the Catilda provides a totally unique record of enslavement.
These are the original photographs from the Clotilda collection. Timothy Mayer, who was the financier of the trip.
Right.
Yes, Captain William Foster.
Right. It's here on the back.
Some inscription.
Captain Foster brought the last cargo of slaves from Ouida, Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa, Southern Alabama in 1860. Okay.
By 1860, the United States was no longer involved in the international slave trade, but we know that there were many shipbuilders and investors who were involved illegally. Mayor commissions Foster to acquire enslaved people from the Benin region and bring them back into the United States illegally. Once they are off-boarded in the Mobile area, Captain Foster actually burns the ship so that no one can find out about this illegal transaction. The 110 people are sold off to planters, and many of them are kept by the Mayer family.
These vivid images of the enslaved survivors of the Clotilda provide a rare and tangible record of their experience.
And here is our Kossela, right? Yeah. And he's smiling. You don't see him smiling a lot.
Yes.
But he's smiling here.
Cujo Kossela Lewis was one of 40 enslaved Africans kept by Timothy Mayer and his brother Jim. These photographs, coupled with interviews Kossela gave to Neil Hurston, provide a powerful first-hand account of the harsh daily life of the enslaved in 1860s Alabama.
Every time the boat stopped at the landing, the overseer, the whipping boss, he go down the gangplank and stand there on the ground. The whip stick in his belt. He holler, "Hurry up there, you! Run it fast! Can't you run it no faster than that? You ain't got enough load. Hurry up!" He cut you with the whip if you ain't run fast enough.
But the real significance of the Hurston interviews is what they tell us about Kossela's stolen African heritage and identity.
When Zora Neale Hurston interviews Kossela, she calls him by his African name. And he's so happy that he hears his name called. He says, "My name, not Cujo Lewis, it Kossela." And he goes on to explain that people like Timothy Mayer could not call his name properly, but he says, "My mama, she named me Kossela." As we remember his name, we are remembering his whole idea, vision, and wisdom about who he is. And this allows us to see what happened on the continent. We began to see not only what happened to us, but the effects of it, the trauma.
I see the great many soldiers, and they run with the big knife, and they catch people and saw the neck with the knife. Then they twist the head so it come off the neck. Oh, Lord, Lord, I see the people get killed so fast. When I think about that time, I try not to cry no more. My eyes, they stop crying, but the tears running down inside me all the time. I no see none of my family.
No poga muge no desu doki 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 ta yo bakama pusi kure jami ho gasutiki ni aya naria kai kai kau amisa moyo kalita mato ute kire wasu waku waku unasera mogegujo nakimochi wea wea yamikabu sekai watakai kedo tajonan kana mabu sikigute yamma orida nade u kirmaga karidina karidemi misurino nosoroko oridate namira misama koripere kwara kuribinsana harikidizara inavidisara uribinada ninana nate irabirikara ita karina musikia no siro otesure nani koma koiara inanta fukano hokari ma merika ba inida narimo kamo kowasisitara kurina onoki havaresu ina.
There's no doubt that as a people, we carry a deep psychological trauma. I can only imagine what it must have been like to see your brother dragged off, or your sister dragged off, or your mother taken, sold, and just what that must have been like, living through that terror of your family just being kind of ripped apart, really, and never seeing them again.
Those people who are the descendants of enslaved people do carry a scar. They do carry a indelible mark, and that mark is associated with an erasure of memory and culture that was stripped on those Atlantic crossings.
Just as Zora Neale Hurston was writing up her interviews with Kossela, another survivor of the Catilda was marching to the courthouse in Selma, Alabama, to demand reparations for her enslavement. Now her great-granddaughters are making the same long walk for justice.
Girls, can you imagine how Grandmama felt walking these roads?
I cannot imagine, but she was a tough lady.
Sisters Dot Sloanes, Gwen Gamble, and Deborah Smith are the great-granddaughters of Matilda McCreer, another survivor of the slave ship, the Catilda. 90 years after she walked 17 miles from the farm where she lived to the courthouse in Selma to demand reparations, they are retracing her footsteps.
Girls, can you imagine how Grandmama felt walking these roads?
I cannot imagine. I'm sure it was rough, but she was a tough lady.
She had a lot of determination, tenacity.
Yes.
Alabama in 1931 was one of the worst places to be living in when you were black because of all the legislation that were there to exploit black people, to terrorize them, to humiliate them. This was also the Great Depression with its misery and an increase in lynching. It took guts for her to actually walk to the courthouse and ask for reparations.
Right in her footsteps.
Yeah, can you imagine how she felt?
No, she was a tired soul.
Matilda was not successful. I mean, she presented her case, but she didn't get anything. And neither her children or grandchildren received any reparations.
Just to be disappointed, denied.
Yeah.
Right. That's really devastating and
it's hurtful.
But in spite of the denial of Matilda's claim for reparations, she had a powerful influence on her great-granddaughters. They would all become civil rights activists. In 1965, when they were teenagers, they took part in a series of famous marches to demand equal voting rights for African Americans in the notoriously segregated state of Alabama.
We all know that there were barriers created to voting for blacks during the 50s in the South especially. There was a heavy disenfranchisement of the black, at that time they called it the Negro population.
Boy, that was some day, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
I remember looking back and seeing all those people just gathering behind us. They were coming from everywhere.
And they had to have known what was ahead of them with the policemen and the dogs.
They did.
The first demonstration the three sisters took part in, on the 7th of March 1965, would become known as Bloody Sunday. The demonstrators had planned to march from Selma to Montgomery to confront segregationist Governor George Wallace. But their route was blocked by state troopers and sheriff's deputies who used clubs, tear gas, and horseback charges to turn them back. TV coverage of this brutal attack prompted thousands of people from all over the country to join a march 2 weeks later. Now, they were led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
My father clearly understood that in order for us to be full participants in society, that we had to have free access to the ballot.
Dr. King was elated just to see that many people supported that march.
Well, it was so well organized.
Yes, it was. And I'll never forget feeling that this was so important for us in our lifetime, and our children, and our families.
This time, the demonstrators, now under the protection of the Alabama National Guard, successfully reached Montgomery.
My daddy was saying, we're gonna keep doing what we're doing because this is the right thing. We have been deprived all these years of our right to vote.
Today I want to say to the people of America and the nations of the world that we are not about to turn around. Yes, sir. We are on the move now. Yes, sir. Yes, we are on the move, and no wave of racism can stop us. Yes,
the events of March 1965 would pave the way for the Voting Rights Act that passed into law on August the 6th that same year.
This brings back memories that's kind of devastating, but you feel proud to know that you were a part of that.
And to know that you have made an impact on so many other people's lives by just a simple march like that.
It really brought about a change.
It was a very necessary part of the struggle. Without voting rights, everything else is hollow. You're at the behest of an entire system with absolutely no say-so.
But while full voting rights for African Americans had been won, the struggle for racial equality was far from over. 60 years on, a series of fatal shootings and one murder that shakes the world draw attention to the unequal treatment of the black community by the police in Britain and the US, sparking a mass movement.
Black Lives Matter!
It spreads across the globe and forces a searching re-examination of the past. Next time, after the fallout of the murder of George Floyd, historian David Olusoga gets his first glimpse of the toppled statue of slave trader Edward Colston.
This is the perfect object. It speaks for this moment and our relationship with a history that for 2 centuries we've just brushed under the carpet.
And Bristol's mayor, Marvin Rees, tells the story of a bus boycott which transformed Britain's fight for civil rights.
It wasn't just about jobs on the buses. That led to the Race Relations Equalities Act in the UK.